On April 26th, 2003, just about 16 years ago, Aaron Ralston, a 27-year-old hiker, decided that he would go for an afternoon hike and wanted to take a day of an adventure in the remote southeast Utah. And he wasn't planning on being gone very long, so he didn't tell anybody where he was going. If you know this story, you know that while on the hike, he fell and got lodged between a rock and the wall of the canyon that he was currently hiking in. And for 5 days, he stayed pinned to that wall. And eventually, he realized what he was going to have to do was cut his arm off in order to survive. He said in this article that he did as an interview with CBS, he said, at one point, he finally said to myself, "You're going to have to cut your arm off, Aaron, but I don't want to cut my arm off. Look, you're going to have to do this." And so he did, and he made it out, and still to this day, he goes and speaks about inspiration and how you can overcome difficult obstacles. But when he was asked whether or not he was willing to cut it off, he was, in order for him to live. I want us to today talk about this same mentality was not first originated in Aaron Ralston. It's actually talked about by our Lord in Matthew 5:27 through 30. And I want us to talk about this mentality of being willing to cut off anything that is going to keep us from being spiritually active. Aaron understood that if he didn't cut his arm off, he wasn't going to live. He was going to die. And so he determined that it was worth losing his arm in order to live. What would it have profited him to have maintained his arm and to have died a couple of days later? He understood that that wasn't worth it. And so he made the hard decision to cut his arm off. In Matthew 5:27 and 28, Jesus states a problem. I want you to first notice what they had heard. In Matthew 5 and verse 27, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said of those of old, 'Thou shalt not commit adultery.'" Now he's taking this beyond what they had heard because there's a problem. And when you study the Sermon on the Mount, you find a section where Jesus is continuously saying things. "You have heard that it has been said, but I say unto you." Now, there was an issue with the Jewish people who they had heard the law, but they thought that what they were hearing was the actual teaching. But Jesus says, "No, you missed it. Let me give you the actual lesson." It's not just that you shall not commit adultery. Let's take this a step further. The actual lesson is in verse 28. "Whosoever looks upon a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, we've talked about this in Bible classes and in other sermons. I do not contend, nor would I believe to teach, that this verse gives a easy out for someone in a marriage to divorce their spouse if they have been caught lusting after another individual. I don't believe the Bible teaches that this is an actual act of adultery. It is really saying that a man that looks upon a woman to lust after her is letting down the defenses and making it easier for him to eventually commit adultery with a woman. And you can understand that. If you've ever been on a diet, you know it's a lot easier to cheat on that diet when you surround yourself with food that you love that you know you shouldn't have. You start to sit there and think, well, I can have just one donut. It won't be that big of a problem. And one donut turns into a couple of pieces of pie and then a couple of other dinners that you shouldn't have. And before you realize it, well, I'm really off the rails here. And how did it start? But you looking at one little donut. Take that from an adultery perspective. If a man were to fill his mind with sensual thoughts of other women that are not his spouse, can you not see how it would eventually become easy for him to commit adultery? Because he has filled his mind with adultery. Jesus is telling them that when you look upon a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart because you're already thinking about it. You know, Joseph in Genesis 39 was able to flee Potiphar's wife because he wasn't lusting after her constantly. He understood there was a difference between a man and his wife and someone's wife. And Joseph said, look, you are Potiphar's, and I can't do this great wickedness and sin against God. And eventually he would flee from her. I want you to notice this word lust in the dictionary, though. The word lust in the dictionary means a passionate desire for something. But there is a Greek perspective that needs to be considered. And in the Greek, epithumeo, it's this idea of something that you do to long after something, but then it says you covet. Now, has the Bible ever spoken of covetousness in a good way? No. Therefore, this idea of lusting is not something that is done between a man and his wife, which is scripturally fine and sound. This is something done between a man and a woman that he is not supposed to have. And Jesus is stating this problem here. You know, when you study lust, you find out that lust brings forth sin. Now, I understand when Jesus speaks of this man who is talking about this mentality of looking upon a woman that he's not able to have, she's forbidden from him, but she looks pleasing, and so he lusts after her. Women are beautiful, and God did design men to notice that beauty. But men, we cannot allow our programming to become an excuse for lusting after people. Notice James 1, verses 12 through 15. Paul is talking, not Paul, I should say James, because that's who wrote it. James is talking here about the idea of lust and how it brings forth sin, and sin brings forth death. He says in verse 12, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he'll receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires or lust and is enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." This is adultery in the mind. It didn't happen, but you're thinking about it. That's what Jesus is talking about. Paul, I should say now, because he wrote Ephesians, in Ephesians 4:17 through 19, he talks about this worldly walk. And we've talked about it in our Ephesians class, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. But he gives these qualifications for what the worldly walk is. It's an aimless walk. It's a blind walk. It's a lifeless walk. But then he tells me about the worthy walk in verses 20 through 23, indicating this idea that you have not so learned Christ, so you're going to live differently. And Jesus is asking these people when he teaches in Matthew 5:27 and 28, it's not just enough to understand that you shouldn't commit adultery. You also need to understand that you shouldn't just look upon a woman and lust after her. Well, how do we fix this problem? Because we know it's a problem. How do we fix it? Jesus does provide an unpleasant solution. Notice verses 29 and verse 30. First, Jesus tells me to pluck out your eye that offends you. In verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. According to Jewish mindset, the right eye and hand, verse 30, was regarded by the Jews as the most precious. And Jesus is telling them, you cut off the most precious eye and hand. And continuing on the discussion of lust, Jesus says, if it causes you to stumble, pluck it out. Get rid of it. Because it's better for you to enter into heaven without one eye than to have your whole body cast into hell. But then he tells me the next one that's also not pleasant. Cut off your hand that offends you. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It's more profitable that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Jesus is making a simple point here. How much is heaven worth to you? And how much is your body and the things that you want to do with your body worth to you? How much is the way of the world worth to you? Do you want to live a life that pleases God? Well, yes, right? Absolutely I do. Then why allow your right eye and your right hand causing you to sin? Why would you allow that? Why wouldn't you take care of that? Jesus is giving an unpleasant solution, but he tells me, Matthew 16:26, what shall it profit a man if he were to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? We just sang about that. What will it truly profit? Every year when these award shows and other types of awards for music and actors and actresses, the awards they win for the movies they're a part of, every year they usually have a people we've lost moment. And they show these images of people who have died in the last year between the last award ceremony and this particular one. And for a few minutes, they're showing these pictures of people. Now, I am a big comic book fan, and so I greatly appreciated the work of Stan Lee, who wrote many of the Marvel comics and created many of the characters that I love and have grown up loving. And from the world's perspective, if you were to ask the average comic book lover, what do you think of Stan Lee? You will get a glowing report. But I don't know that Stan Lee was a Christian. So let me ask you, what did it profit him to get a worldly report that says he's a good comic book writer and to have lost his own soul? What do? Your right eye offends you, pluck it out. Your right hand causes you to sin, pluck it out. Cut it off. Get rid of it. Now, is this a literal execution of the act? Am I really supposed to believe that if someone lusts after an individual, you know what you got to do, right? You're going to have to pluck your eye out. Or you know your right hand's been causing you to stumble lately, we need to cut that off. Is this a literal execution of this? No. When I study World Video Bible School notes, I find a literal execution of this would turn the church into a hospital. Because don't we all suffer from sin from time to time? And we only have the ability to cut off 2 hands and pluck out 2 eyes. Is that really going to stop us from sinning from that point forward? No, we understand that the plucking out of the eye or cutting off the hand will not keep a person from sinning. The literal execution then wouldn't solve the problem. But the person should be ready to rid the sin that he has in his life or that she has in her life. So our most prized possessions are not worth the loss of our souls. And do whatever it takes then to keep yourself from sinning. I have a lot of prized possessions in this life. Obviously, I would chiefly tell you that my wife and my son are some of my most prized possessions that I'm able to say that they're mine. My wife is my wife. My son is my son. I'm blessed to be able to call them that. And those are the greatest gifts that God has given me. But I also have other things in life that I enjoy that are not necessarily my wife or my son. I enjoy playing a good board game. I enjoy doing that. Love it. I enjoy playing a good video game. If you have a good video game, I would play it. I would enjoy doing that. I enjoy watching a good movie or television show. But any one of those things could keep me from heaven if I allow it to. Suppose I love board games more than the Lord, or the movies more than the Lord. Suppose that all of my life is found in my job or in the things that I love to do. Would Jesus find that to be pleasing to him if he sees that I am spending a life trying to gain the whole world and not taking care of my own soul? Not according to Matthew 16:26. Jesus wants you and he wants me to take care of our souls. Now, that does not mean that we can't have jobs that we enjoy. I like my job. I enjoy it. And I hope that each and every one of you enjoy the jobs that you might be a part of and working in. Does that mean we can't have hobbies such as enjoying a good night of playing board games or going to the movies or having a good night where we watch a television show? That's not what that means at all. But it does mean when I am given the choice between God and that, I choose God. Not because I think of this as not fun or not exciting, but because this is the most important. We could be playing a board game right now and we would have fun. But you've chosen the better part. You're at worship. You're here to worship the Lord. And a mindset that says every time I get the opportunity to show that love for God, I'm going to. It's not just shown in worship. I know a lot of times we'll preach on church attendance, but it's shown in other ways too. A love for God isn't just a love that shows up for both services on Sunday and a Bible class and then Bible class Wednesday night and the devotional. A love for God is also one that in your own private home life wants to be with the Lord and studies about the Lord. A true love for God is one that even when no one else is around, you find yourself praying to God, talking to Him, wanting a relationship with Him. It's a lot easier than I think we have made it out to be. With our modern technology, I have the opportunity when I'm driving down the road to listen to the Bible or listen to podcasts of a religious mindset. I have so many things at my fingertips now than we ever have had before. And a lot of times when I drive down the road, I either do one of two things. I either listen to music or I listen to a podcast. That's not wrong to listen to music, and sometimes I will. I listened to music on the way home last night. Sometimes I listen to a podcast on my way to the office or just driving down the road. I can make time for God even when I don't think I have it. That's time that you're just in a vehicle. You mow the lawn. Maybe you're a farmer. Maybe you do that for a living. You've got some time while you're working the fields to be able to listen to something, to help draw you closer to God. And I found this to be true. When I have a spiritual life outside of just preparing a sermon, my Christianity feels a lot stronger. Now, I can sit there in my office all week and only study for the sermon that's coming up. And sometimes I'm studying quite a big a subject, and so maybe that is all I dedicate the week to. That's fine. But there are also weeks where in the midst of studying for a sermon, I'm also doing a private study of something else. I'm also listening to some other podcast or some other Bible class that someone has done to try to able my spiritual mind and get it stronger. And I have noticed when I make that a point in my own spiritual life, I am a stronger Christian. And all of us could do that. I know that not every one of us works a job where you can sit down and study the Bible all day. But I also know that many of you have the opportunity to listen to a podcast behind, and you've told me that that's what you do at work. And that's wonderful. And all of us could make an effort to be so spiritually minded that when we're faced with something that keeps us from Christ, we're more than able to cut it off. We're more than able to get rid of it. As a little boy, I was given some money to go to the Santa shop that we had at school. I don't remember what it was called. But I was given that money to buy gifts for the whole family. I turned around and bought gifts for myself. Now, I will say, to be fair to myself, and I'm joking when I say this, I did spend 75 cents on the family. But the majority of the money I was given went towards gifts for me. And when I brought those home, I was all excited. And my dad and my mom, who had given me the money, said, "Son, we gave you that money to help you buy Christmas gifts for the family, and you've just bought gifts for yourself. You're going to have to get rid of these." You know, I didn't want to. And in that moment, I loved those toys more than I loved my family. And even when I was shopping, I proved that. I loved my toys and the gifts that I wanted more than I loved my family because I wasn't willing to buy them gifts. I've learned since that there is something more important than buying yourself stuff, although there can be a time where you do treat yourself to some things. It's not a sin to do that, but it was wrong for me to have taken money that was intended for other people and use it on myself. Now, when Christmas time rolls around, my wife and I will sit down and say, let's get gifts for the family. And we truly buy gifts for the family. We try to sit there and think about what would they like. I've learned my lesson. From a spiritual perspective, can I be honest with you? Haven't you, like me, sometimes been sitting in the pew and have found your mind wandering? I have. Certain days where I'm just not focused like I should be. And so I begin to wander and think about other things. What am I going to do this afternoon? I need to get this, and this done, or I need to focus on this, and if I don't get that done, where are we going to go after this? How are we going to feed ourselves today? Could it be possible that when I allow my mind to wander like that, I am saying that those things are more important than God? Could it be possible then for me to cut those off from my mind? Jesus says that it's possible. If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. This is not literal, it's spiritual. If something is keeping me from being the best Christian and the best type of person I'm supposed to be, I've got to get rid of it. So how can I do that? By focusing on the Lord and living a life that is God-centered. It's possible. I do whatever it takes to keep myself spiritually pure. So what do we learn from Jesus' message? First, we learn that we've got to keep our hearts from lust. Obviously, that's understood. I cannot have a mindset that I'm allowed to look upon any woman and lust after her. That's not right. I'm to keep my heart from lust. There are some excuses out there that try to justify lusting after others. Two that came to my mind were, well, I wouldn't lust if they would dress better. Or I don't struggle with lust, so when I'm looking at them, I'm not lusting, I'm admiring. Look, I understand that the world could have a better idea of modesty, but just because that's true doesn't give me the license to look. I'm to keep my head on a swivel. I'm to keep my heart pure, even if others won't. I don't get to make this excuse with anything else. So why can't I make it with lusting? I can't. Though people will try, it's not a good excuse. The truth is, I must take responsibility for myself, and you must take responsibility for yourself. And if all of us would do that, we would have a little bit less of a problem, but the world is still going to be the world. So I've got to keep my heart from lust. Secondly, I've got to cut off whatever hinders me from getting to heaven. This really is a very small ask from Jesus. When you think about all Jesus gave up to come to this earth and die for us, according to Philippians 2, 4 through 9. The smallest thing Jesus can ask is, can you get rid of anything that's keeping you from me? When Jesus gave up heaven to come down here and die a death that he wasn't deserving of? Thirdly, we can get rid of anything that is hindering us. In 1 John 5 and verse 4, it tells me, whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And in verse 5 it says, who is he who overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? What does believing that Jesus is the Son of God require, though? You've got to look at verse 3. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Jesus made a commandment in Matthew 5, 29 and 30 to pluck or cut whatever's keeping us from him. And if I'm to take what John writes in 1 John 5, then I can understand that it's not a very difficult task to cut off whatever is hindering me. I can do it. And you can do it. But will we? This is Aaron Ralston. And we started off the lesson talking about him, and I left out a couple of key bits of information that some of you who know the story probably picked up on. If you don't know the story, this was something that amazed me. When he finally made the determination that it was time to cut his arm off, he realized something very quickly. He had a bad knife. And his exact quote was, "I'm stymied. I'm going to die there," he thought. Not so much because of the boulder holding my arm, but because the knife is too dull to cut through the bone. I can't make it. So I'm just going to die. But he finished the task, and he got free, and he got help. Something that when he left for that day, he cherished in his arm. Very quickly became the thing keeping his chances for survival at an all-time low. His experience poses an inevitable question: could I do this if I were faced with doing it? He would respond and say, yes, I think it's the typical, human response is of empathy. I think it was the act of the amputation that grabs us all like, wow, he did that. That's crazy. But really, it was a very simple thing. I'm going to do what I have to do in order to get back to the people who are important to me. When he thought of his loved ones and missing out on being with his loved ones, he determined that the arm was worth letting go of. And I think if any of us were found in that situation, we could come to the same conclusion. It's better to get rid of our arm than to die and to never get to be with our loved ones again. Isn't Jesus supposed to be our loved one? Am I not supposed to have a relationship with Christ where I love him? Yes. Doesn't the Bible tell me in 1 John 4 and verse 19 that we love him because he first loved us? Yeah. So what will I do to have the mentality of Aaron that says, I'm going to do whatever I have to do in order to get back to the person who is the most important to me? Is Jesus today the most important person in your life? It is easy to say yes. It is harder to know that it's true, because a real knowing of it being true takes a self-examination of our lives, and sometimes that's not pleasant. It is much harder for me today to really examine my life and ask, is Jesus the most important person in my life? If he is, that's great. And you've got a great mindset as a Christian. If he is not, what has become the most important thing in your life? What have you replaced him with? Because truly, if all of us were to sit there and realize that we're not spending our lives trying to please Christ, we would have to know we've replaced him with something. So what is it? I can't answer that for you. You have to answer it. But you have an opportunity right now to determine that it won't be the most important thing anymore. But you have to choose that. The devil has got us, when we have Jesus as the least important person in our life, pinned up against a canyon wall with a boulder holding us down. And we have to determine that we will get out of that situation, even if it means an amputation. My cousin Caleb, faced with a very similar problem, got one of the rarest forms of cancer. Believe it, if I remember correctly, only 22 people a year get it, which means the chances of survival are very slim because there's not a huge amount to go off of. And at a certain point, he was faced with an amputation from the knee down. And he said, do it. And asking him about it, he still would tell you it was a pretty easy decision. Same as Aaron. It's a pretty easy decision when it's that or your death. I am here to tell you today Jesus is talking of a situation that would keep one from heaven in Matthew 5:27-30. Because he says it is better to go into heaven without all of the members of your body than to have a whole body cast into hell. And so what today might need to be cut off? I can't answer that for you. Only you can. But when you and I have a mentality that we will say, none of self and all of thee, we will truly start living like Christians. Because everything that we do and every decision we make will be predicated on, would Jesus want me to do this? Would Jesus be pleased with me if I did this? And so maybe you're here this morning and you're not a child of God, but you desire to become one. That would please Jesus. And that would be a great way for our worship to end this morning. With a baptism, that would be a great way for our worship services to come to a close. To have a baptism, take the Lord's Supper together, and close in song and prayer, I think all of us would be edified by that. And if you want to do that, you have to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And after doing that, you've got to live a faithful life, cutting off and getting rid of whatever is keeping you from the Lord. Are you willing to do that today? It is easy to say it because no one today is actually faced with an amputation in front of them. But spiritually speaking, I think all of us may have something that we could give up that is either hindering us from Jesus or will get to the point where it does. So won't you cut off whatever it is right now as together we stand and sing?